Cool. Okay, so this is our last session together, and I will take because there's only a few of us. It'll be a good chance for us to be able to kind of have a kind of more in-depth conversation and to go into some issues a bit more deeper. There are still some more people logging in, but I'll get going now, and we'll go from there. We're going to be focusing on Kabbalistic ideas that relate particularly to the Messiah and the end of days, the coming of the Moshiach, the end of days, the Messianic Era, what's known as the resurrection of the dead, or in Hebrew, Tchiyat HaMeitim. And we'll also kind of perhaps touch upon maybe some issues of reincarnation. There are concentric circles of reincarnation and resurrection of the dead. We won't go into reincarnation in too much detail. I sent off that source piece to look at that source book, which kind of covers some of the issues. Plus, I've sent in a message as well, some recommended reading if you're interested in that type of thing. Plus, again, you can always feel free to reach out if you have any questions that relate to any of those issues. We'll kind of finish off. We'll start off by kind of concluding the 10 Sefirot, and the 10th Sefirah, the 10th emanation of God in the world, according to Kabbalistic teachings, directly links to this aspect of the Messianic age. And just to kind of take us through one more time from top to bottom, and how the 10 Sefirot relate not only to God in the world, but also relate to us as human beings. We start off here at the very, very top. And I spoke about a few weeks ago how the Bina and Chokhmah and Keter relate to our cognitive ability, or also the planning stages, as Kabbalah teaches, of God's plan before creating the world. We learn in Proverbs that there was a Torah kind of already written, or served as a blueprint for God in the creation of the world. Chokhmah relates to intuition, the subconscious, instinctive thought, and Binah is almost on the opposite end of measured, logical thinking, insight, understanding. For anyone that's read, I didn't mention it at the time, but there's a really wonderful comparison. There's a famous book called Thinking, Fast and Slow by the psychologist and behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, who talks about system 1 and system 2 within the brain, the way that we make decisions, in system 1 and system 2. And these two systems can essentially explain every single one of our interactions in the world and how we process the information in our mind. And system 1 is completely intuitive. The things that we do without even thinking. And there are aspects in our lives that we can teach ourselves. For example, when driving, that we get to a point when we drive that we do things instinctively without necessarily being super conscious and placing all our effort into that process. There are things, for example, hard mathematical sums, or doing our tax returns, for example, that we have to engage our brains in a very, very deep, methodical and energy-consuming way. And actually, these two aspects of Kabbalah relate to those two systems perfectly. We mentioned that Chokhmah are these thoughts that kind of almost outside of our control pop into our mind, and then Binah is the interpretation of those thoughts. And there's plenty of books on kind of the psychology of Kabbalah. But that's just an interesting point I kind of wanted to throw in there. Also, left brain, right brain, which can also maybe link into system 1, system 2. In any event, I thought that was interesting. We then move down into how if this top stage here is planning, the next 3 relate to our interactions in the world, right? So here is the planning stage. This is the interaction. So in the realm of God, this is then how God then went on to create the world with a balance of both mercy and justice, as seen in the 2 names of God, the 2 prominent names of God that appear in the Bible, the Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, which we'll say Hashem or Adonai, or Elohim, which Yud Hey Vav Hey is mercy, Elohim is justice, and the balance between the two. And if you look at the narrative within the Bible and when those names are used, they would generally relate to whatever narrative is going on. It's got whatever narrative is happening, whether God is being merciful or God is being purely judgmental, trying to pursue justice. So too in our lives, we try and seek this balance. There are times not only within ourselves, but also within our relationships, we try and find a balance, right, between just giving and showing love, unconditional love, and also within our relationships, striking that balance of fairness and wanting relationships to be reciprocal. And also within society too, right? The understanding that there needs to be this balance between love and mercy and unconditional kindness, and also justice. I mean, when those two aspects come together, according to Kabbalah, we have the concept of Tiferet, which means beauty, also could be reinterpreted as truth, emet. That ultimately we're trying to seek a balance between the two. We'll jump between both, but the ultimate goal is to find that balance. Last week, we then moved into these three at the bottom, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, that directly kind of relate to how God interacts within the world. Kind of driven by the concept of theodicy, driven by the concept of why do bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. And Netzach and Hod kind of lean towards, suggest answers to that issue that history is not just a random assortment of events, but there is a meaning and a purpose to history, particularly how it's viewed by Kabbalah. And we're going to get into that in a bit. We're going to get into that in more detail today, but Kabbalists particularly will look at history completely through the eyes of how God interacts within the world. And there are issues there. There are definite issues there. We'll discuss those soon. But they see Netzach, the idea of victory, that ultimately the good will be victorious. And ultimately, we will see the splendor and majesty when those who aren't deserving of goodness will receive their just deserts. And that all kind of comes to the concept of Yesod. Yesod, foundation, is the point at which God enters into the world. The way in which we, as mere mortals of flesh and blood, are able to interact with the spiritual through kind of classical Jewish mitzvot that also have Kabbalistic underpinnings. The idea of taking something physical, whether it's food and reciting a blessing, whether it's taking a ram's horn and using it on Rosh Hashanah to blow the shofar, whether it's taking water and dough and baking it and turning it into matzah or challah, or taking a candle and lighting it for Shabbat, or taking physicality and giving it a spiritual purpose. That connects us to the spiritual realm. And there are these kind of extra practical Kabbalistic aspects which certain individuals practice, whether we're talking about certain forms of meditation, whether it relates to the specific 10 Sfirot meditation, or we're talking about the meditation of the prayers of the Shema and Amidah, whether we're looking even at physical symbols and using those to interact with God, which aren't necessarily practiced so much today, but you're looking at the writing of the 72 letter name of God and placing that. Some people place it underneath their bed, or certain prayers underneath their bed that serves as some kind of protection for them. Or we're looking at, we mentioned briefly, the red string, which kind of also has this biblical connection as it connects to one of the four mothers, Rachel, and how that also serves as some kind of protection or warding off evil. Those are less practiced, but also are believed by Kabbalists to kind of connect this aspect of yourself. And finally, which we'll discuss today, is Malchut. Now, Malchut here ultimately is the most important one of the 10 Sfirot, because it's the coming together. It's the coming together of the emanations of God and us as human beings. The 9 here ultimately come from God, or wholly spiritual, and they can teach us things and they can give us insights into the way that we behave. But Malchut is this ultimate coming together of godliness and humankind. That unlike these, which are God's interactions in the world, Malchut is human beings' actions in the world. Here, then you can see here on the right-hand side other aspects of how it's written here. Here's a beautiful one. It's the most important because it's not just God acting merely by himself, but rather God acting through us. When we as human beings take the step forward to bring spirituality, morality into the world. That is Malchut. And the word Malchut, kingdom, relates to this kind of final stage, this ultimate goal that, not only Judaism, but other faiths have been aiming towards, which is the end of days, the bringing of the Messianic era. Now we'll kind of have a look and we'll take a stab at what that means, what that looks like, how Kabbalistic teachings refer to. Is there a time frame? Is there a certain year? What does it look? How do we approach it? What does it mean for Jews, and what does it mean for non-Jews, and what does it mean in terms of resurrection of the dead and everything I mentioned at the beginning piece. What I want to do before we kind of get into that, it's going to come and bring us back to all of us together. If I can get off, hold on. Let me fix my mouse. Hold on a second. I'm trying to do, there we go. Stop share. There we go. Hello, Maria. Hello, Elia. Hello, Maytav. Aaron. Just a quick thing, throwing it back at you. The concept of the Messiah is a well-known one, not only within Jewish teaching, but outside, the whole world over, predominantly because of, the religions of Christianity and Islam, at least, are based on this concept of the coming of some kind of savior, the coming of some kind of Messiah, bringing humanity back to the true service of God. And the world is very much aware of this concept. But just kind of throwing it out to you, what kind of exposure, what have you learnt about before with regards to Messiah, Mashiach, anything that relates to that? You can come back to me and say absolutely nothing, and that's fine. But what just out of interest, so we can I can gauge where we're at. What have you guys learnt before, heard before, with regards to the Messiah, Mashiach, anything like that? And I'm also happy to take silences, not that much. Yeah, Jacob.
I think I was always taught when I was younger that it would be that Mashiach would the time of Mashiach would be sort of preceded by tumult. There'd be some sort of destruction, and then that would be an indicator or a sign that Mashiach was coming. That's one understanding I have.
Fantastic. We're going to look at that. There's two approaches in Kabbalah in terms of how Mashiach can come, and one of them does refer to kind of the world just descending into decay, which is very similar, right? We'll look at it similar-ish to Christian teachings, perhaps of concepts of Armageddon. Right? We'll look at that too a bit, and how it relates and how it links perhaps even to Jewish teachings. Anyone else before I kind of bring us back, and we'll continue? Anyone else? Any kind of ideas, concepts that people have heard before as relates to the Messiah, Mashiach, end of days, resurrection of the dead, anything like that? Okay. Wait, okay, cool. Okay, so let me bring you back to my screen. Thank you, Jacob. We're gonna get to that momentarily. So just to break it down. In very, very basic terms, that the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, the Messianic era, at least according to Maimonides, according to the Rambam, is a foundational belief within Judaism, a fundamental principle, one of the 13 fundamental principles as explained by Maimonides, the Rambam. That in itself is interesting as to why he places it there, but it's part and parcel of Jewish belief. Now, again, as I mentioned before, in Kabbalah, Kabbalists will look at world history not just a random series of events, but a planned destiny leading to a utopian goal. Now, that again is also problematic because we can definitely look, particularly as Jews, at various different aspects of Jewish history and say, well, where was God in such and such a place? And how could it be that this took place through the hand of God? And even within that sentence introduces a kind of a separation within Jewish philosophy. Potentially, and you can obviously guess, I'm referring to post-Holocaust theology and how the Jewish world responded to the Holocaust. That there are numerous different approaches. Some kind of taking a deeper theological perspective that, okay, how can we integrate belief in God, particularly this Kabbalistic belief that God plans history and therefore, ultimately is responsible in some way for the Holocaust. The classical Kabbalists post-Shoah, post the Holocaust, will unashamedly say that yes, the essentially each aspect of the Shoah, even though there is human agency and free will exists, was planned because of the path of history that must be carried out in order for this end utopian goal. Now that is problematic, and you had other, obviously you had on the spectrum of Orthodox, but also non-Orthodox Jewish philosophers coming out and saying that this was difficult to stomach, and very much focus on the human hand within the Holocaust. We look at, for example, Telushkin, Prager, Sachs, who talk about that it wasn't God that built Auschwitz, man did, and that the Holocaust was a manifestation of evil through the hands of human beings. And we're not talking, I don't want to go into too much detail, but if we're talking about Kabbalah, the vast majority of Kabbalists will see even events like the Holocaust as part of this ultimate plan. That's difficult to say in a sentence. It's a heavy sentence. It's a sentence which shouldn't just come easily from the tongue, but it does. And it's caused divisions within the Jewish world, and that's something perhaps we'll explore like at a later date. Hopefully, we're going to be carrying on these sessions at least once a month, not necessarily to do with Kabbalah, but with other Jewish issues. We can talk about that at a different time. However, it's difficult to separate Judaism with Jewish eschatology, the belief in the end of days. And there are three different stages: the era of the Messiah, the afterlife, and the world of resurrection. And the ultimate piece is that after a certain period of time, after the coming of an individual called the Messiah, called the Moshiach, the world will be a utopia and that everyone will live in peace. That's not to say that everyone will be Jewish, and it's not to say that everyone will believe in God. However, the Jewish people will be able to live and practice their religion freely, free of anti-Semitism and free of threat. And all other nations and all other religions will also be able to practice their beliefs and non-beliefs in a free, equal society. That, in a couple of sentences, is how Kabbalah and Judaism in general views the Messianic era. Now, there's a few pieces in here which, again, you can take a look at this in your own time, and I won't go into these sources because there's lots of writing, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but again, you can look at this in your own time. But there is, as I mentioned before, this kind of, you could say, contradiction when it comes to the Messianic era and the concept of free will. Meaning, if the Messianic era, this utopia, is predetermined, how could it be that we have real true agency, really true free will? And it links into this post-Holocaust theology that what really caused human beings to behave the way that they do? Is it human agency? Or is there is this underpinning that God is pulling the strings, so to speak. Now, the way that one Kabbalist, the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who I've mentioned many, many times, a very important individual, he answers it by saying as follows: there are actually, within every single human being, there is a constant battle between the physical and the spiritual. That if one is able to connect to the spiritual and listen to what their soul is telling them, they will be able to connect to the train to the Messianic era. And if an individual goes the other way and just kind of feeds their physical desires, then the world will stay stagnant and nothing will be achieved. And we won't end up in this place. And so free will still exists. And the only way to kind of jump on the train of destiny as driven by God is to listen to the soul. Now, that there are other Kabbalists who disagree and say, whatever you do, whatever happens, as Jacob suggested, as Jacob taught, that ultimately, whatever happens, the Moshiach will come. The Ramchal disagrees slightly, but we'll get to those in a moment. There are other pieces too, right, how to bring about this world to come, how to bring about the Messianic era. Ultimately, it comes down to, as taught in the Talmud and other different places, the performance of certain mitzvot. That when we do good deeds, the reward is not given to us now. Judaism doesn't necessarily, okay, so two different things. Judaism, on the one hand, classical Judaism, doesn't believe in any form of reward in this world. However, Kabbalistic teachings, Kabbalah does. We find in the Zohar, in many different places, a Jewish version of karma, that what you do right now in this world will directly affect the pleasure and the reward and the goodness that comes to you in this world. Because this world is just a smoke screen for a spiritual reality, and that by interacting with this physical world, by performing good deeds, which are inherently spiritual, you will then be rewarded in kind, not only spiritually, but also physically too. But the ultimate goal, either way, according to Kabbalah, according to classical Judaism, is to bring the world back to a reality that existed when there was the Garden of Eden. Now, the similarities here between Christianity and Judaism, you'll perhaps begin to notice that Christianity is founded on the idea of the fall of man, the original sin of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, and that kind of creating the sinful reality that we live in today. Judaism is slightly different. The eating from the tree of knowledge didn't create sin; it just created the knowledge of good and evil. It introduced free will into the world. It presented a false reality that all there is physicality in the world, when in fact there is also spirituality. And the goal here is, according to Kabbalah, is to reveal that spirituality, to tear down that curtain, to tear down that wall, and to see the spiritual world that lies beneath. Now, we do that through a process, through a phrase which is very, very well known, called Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam comes up on multiple occasions, particularly today, and I'll explain why. And again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term. That Tikkun Olam today, I'm sure many of you will know, is essentially a synonym for social justice, a synonym for equality in the world, and it's become the mantra of non-Orthodox Jewish movements. And on the one hand, that kind of ultimately is the aim for the Messianic era. That the bringing of social equality, that every single human being living on this planet is able to practice their beliefs, to not be in fear of their life, to be able to take care of themselves, to essentially have access to all human rights. That is how we at least understand Tikkun Olam today with a modern lens. Tikkun Olam traditionally, in traditional Judaism, kind of had this extra aspect of Tikkun Olam, meaning not only the perfection of the world, the physical world of society and humanity, but perfection of the spiritual world as well. Now, unfortunately, or I mean, this is my opinion, unfortunately, because the let's say the conservative movement, reform movement, liberal movement has taken Tikkun Olam to mean social justice and to mean equality, which is a beautiful thing. The Orthodox world, for whatever reason, has kind of dropped that from their mantra, for whatever reason, right? Because they want to disassociate themselves from non-Orthodox Judaism. And Tikkun Olam now in the Orthodox world is purely a spiritual thing, when in fact, originally it was a synthesis of both worlds. And in Kabbalah, we do see that. We see in many, many different occasions where Tikkun Olam is not only the correction of the world as bringing the world back to this spiritual state as seen in the Garden of Eden, but also a fixing of society, a bringing of equality, an ending of suffering, an ending of violence, an ending of wars. And again, different discussion for a different time, the way that we look at different Jewish denominations and how they interact and where we should be in terms of bringing viewpoints together and not, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, let's say. But at least in Kabbalah, Tikkun Olam is the path in which we reach the Messianic age. Now, coming to this aspect which I mentioned at the beginning of, classical Judaism talks more about action, right? Be a good person, be a good Jew, do mitzvot, blah, 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 blah. Kabbalah speaks on a deeper level of when will this happen and what will it look like? The Maharal of Prague, here is a synagogue here in Prague, the Maharal, the link between the classical Kabbalists of the 16th, 15th and 16th century and the Hasidic masters of the 17th and 18th century. Here was this bridge in the middle, famous for the story of the golem, this clay monster that he placed the name of God inside and then brought it to life and protected the Jewish community in Prague. Talks about how the history of the world is like the creation story. That there are 1,000-year periods that link to each of the 7 days of the week. And just like the 7th day of the week, Shabbat, is this ultimate, the culmination of creation, the ultimate expression of spirituality in the world, so too, the 7,000th year, the 7,000th Jewish year, will see the coming of the Messiah. The seventh millennia begins in the year 6000. In the year 6000, which is 220. My math is really bad. How long? 220. Wow, it's getting close. 220 years away. According to the Maharal, when we enter that year, that will bring in the Messiah. Talks about how over here the entire world will be united to the point where the whole world will be complete and perfect. Now, what I wanted to just kind of briefly touch upon here is particularly in Israel today, or in the Jewish world today, religious Zionism has kind of taken up this particular belief system, has taken up this notion of us living in the Messianic era. Religious Zionism, but also Kabbalistic Judaism, that by taking a look at current events and how they are now placing the world almost at the apex of what these Jewish people would believe is the birth pains of the Messiah, or the prologue to the coming of the Moshiach. And there are different reasons that individuals would say this. Number one, the gathering in of the exiles, the gathering of the exile, that all Jewish people are now returning to Israel. One of the signs, which we'll get to in a moment, as stated by Maimonides, which will lead to the coming of the Messiah. Not only that, but the way in which the world is poised and the way we are able to interact with one another also relates to different aspects that are mentioned within the Sefer HaBahir. For example, according to certain Kabbalistic teachings, that when the Messiah comes, the whole world will know, instantly kind of understand that this is now the process by which we will live in a perfect and complete world. Now, writing that, whether it's 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, is completely and utterly insane. And how will that even work? It must be miraculous that it enters into the mind of all people. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. But nowadays, it's not such a big deal, right? That if the whole world knowing something almost instantaneous isn't really that far-fetched whatsoever. Number two, another interesting piece, which is actually mentioned in the Torah, in Shemot, where a verse states that God will bring the Jewish people into the land of Israel al kanfei nesharim, on the wings of eagles. And that was discussed and debated upon within the Talmud of what does that mean? Is it, I mean, it doesn't say this, but is it like the Lord of the Rings, where you have these huge birds that are bringing the people into Israel? Whatever. Again, I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. The concept of bringing people back to Israel on planes, which could perhaps be seen like eagles or giant metal eagles, isn't again necessarily far-fetched. And the process by which for the Messiah to come in the modern day isn't necessarily that far-fetched. Again, it's not necessarily miraculous, and there are those who disagree and say that, okay, we have all this modern technology and still there will be miracles that will happen outside of nature. But there are those who say, well, the world is now poised for the Messiah to come. Also, when you look at the Ethiopian Aliyah, there were many, the Ethiopian Jewish community, the Kihila Bita particularly, who when they first saw a plane for the very first time and knew this pasuk, knew this verse, they recited this verse when they saw this plane before they boarded that was going to bring them into Israel. Now we get into the idea, this is the point here, this source here, that Jacob mentioned before. According to the Zohar, there are two different paths in which the Messiah can perhaps come. The first could be either because the Jewish people are deserving, they all repent and they return, and the whole world is kind of fixed and comes to a certain place. There's the other side, which actually is just predetermined and will be come in a completely different manner. The redemption comes at a predetermined time when Israel is not necessarily worthy of it, at a time when the whole world is destitute. Another example over here. Wait, I want to go back because this links into it. Over here. Here we go. I'll get to it in a moment. The whole world just will be in such a destroyed state. That's when the Messiah will come. Mentioned here in the Zohar, in the Orach Chaim, and other places too. And those two different paths. There is this other aspect too, as mentioned in the book of Zechariah. The Messiah, the Moshiach, will come riding upon a donkey. For any of you who have been in Sfat, there's that famous alleyway, which is, as tradition says, will be the location in which the Messiah will ride down this alleyway on a donkey on their way to Jerusalem. There are other questions too, right? And again, depending on who you ask and who you speak to, of who the Messiah will be. According to the Maimonides, the Messiah is a regular person, not an individual who performs miracles. In fact, Maimonides states in the laws of kings and their wars that if an individual comes and starts to perform miracles and says they are Messiah, the Messiah shouldn't believe them. And it's an individual, a charismatic individual who will bring about equality, bring about world peace, will allow Jewish people to return to Israel and allow them to establish themselves again, to practice their religion in a safe and equal environment. That also means the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. And it also means the reinstatement of the Davidic dynasty. There are questions that come in of, can the Messiah be, that traditionally, right, as we see in many, many cases within Jewish writings, the Messiah is referred to as a male. Question comes in, particularly today, could Mashiach be female? Could the Mashiach be a woman? And there is a discussion, particularly within, there's the commentaries on the book of Devorah, and other locations in which there are cases, clear cases in Tanakh, where the leaders, military leaders and spiritual leaders of the Jewish people were female. And again, depending on who you ask and depending on who your teacher is and who your rabbi is, they'll tell you different things. There's no real reason really today, if you believe in the concept of a Messiah, of an individual, essentially a leader coming and bringing essentially this utopian world, why that individual cannot be female. But I'll send you over some sources that also refer to that as well. There are other kind of instances, especially in Kabbalah, are there things that we can do to bring the Messiah? There's two famous concepts. Number one, that if all Jewish people keep 2 Shabbatot, that will instantly bring the final redemption, instantly bring the Moshiach. Interestingly, if anyone's aware of like the Shabbat project, there's this project that started in South Africa that's spread around the world like once a year. There's like a big push for all Jewish people all around the world and all communities to recognize Shabbat in some way, by lighting Shabbat candles or by having a meal or having Havdalah. It was actually started by a group of people who had this particular belief based on this source here in the Talmud. I'll bring back my laser pointer because they're over here, this one. There's another one which is beautiful, which comes from the Chafetz Chaim, also the Sfat Emet, who was the second leader of the Gera Hasidim, a Kabbalist, who said that, according to tradition, the reason for the exile 2,000 years ago, the Jewish people from Israel all around the world, was because of baseless hatred. The idea that we distrusted, disliked, hated people for no reason. And the only way to bring that back is to have baseless love. To love people just because they are human beings, because we are created within the image of God. There's another piece here, also the same piece from the Chafetz Chaim, and it kind of, rather than it being this kind of miraculous thing, so every Jew keeps Shabbat and then snap, Messiah is here. There's a method here. There's something about humanity, about society, and what it means to create a better world. Particularly here with the Chafetz Chaim, particularly here with the Sfat Emet, of if we are careful in avoiding both baseless hatred and speaking derogatorily, I can't speak at the moment, derogatorily, I can't speak, of one another, you get what I mean, that will bring about the Messiah, but not because of any miraculous, because we truly understand what it means to live in a shared society. Aaron, let me see. Okay, so I've got a question over here. It is expected that some people will be left out of this utopia. I can't imagine the perfect world for the Jewish people. Is everyone's idea of perfection? Says, okay, excellent, wonderful question. So let's get into that now. The idea of this utopia is based on a verse in Isaiah, very famous verse, famous because I know it and I know famous things. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, the lion will lie down with the sheep. All human beings will take their weapons and turn them into plowshares, and there'll be no more wars fought ever again. Now, let's dig into what that means in terms of like this utopia. According to, there is the concept of, number one, of the war of Gog and Magog, which you may have heard of before, which is like this war to end all wars, which, again, modern day Kabbalists, again, those who like to kind of view history and modern day events as a continuation basically of the biblical narrative, will place, you'll see like signs, posters sometimes in Israel, in certain communities in Israel, of Gog is, it's 100% Gog is Iran, right? And Magog is Hamas. And the war of Gog and Magog is at our doorstep. And this is what has been prophesied for 2,000 years. So there is this aspect that, right, there will be people who are left out, those who are, quote unquote, the enemies of the Jewish people, or who wish the destruction of the Jewish people, or who wish the destruction of any other group of people within the world. So that's number one. That there is a way that there is this utter like destruction, desolation, as Jacob described beforehand, perhaps some kind of great war, maybe, that's written about in Kabbalah. Now, number two, the idea of the idea of perfection. This is how Maimonides describes it. And again, from us sitting here now, looking out to the world, we can't necessarily see how this will look, what it will be, but it's allowing each. There's two different routes. So I'll go back a second. There's the John Lennon route, and there's the route of societies and groups. So the route of, let's say, John Lennon, of imagine a world where there are no nations and there are no religions, and everyone kind of lives together as one global community, isn't necessarily the Jewish view of utopia. However, that one would kind of link into this idea of a perfect world where everyone is included. The Jewish view is that there is a benefit to have separate societies. There is a benefit to say that I'm closer and more connected to a certain group of people. For example, that if you're about to, let's say, propose to someone, and you get down on one knee and you're about to give them a ring, and you say to them, listen, I love you more than anyone else I love you, you're the most incredible person in the world, and I love you more than everything in the world. And you're about to give them the ring, and then you look and you say, and I love you just as much as that person, I love you just as much as that person, I love you just as much as that person. You'll get a slap in the face. Transpose that onto society, there are benefits, as we can see within personal relationships, to having an understanding that we are closer to, we have more in common with certain groups of people. Not to the degradation of other people, just that you have your like close circle of friends, and then larger circle of friends, and then people who you work with, whatever. Now, again, I'm sorry, this is such a long-winded answer to your question, but the Messianic age is a utopia in which each society, each faith group, each nation is able to live together. They're able to function together. They're able to understand a common good of we are all living on one planet together, and there is no use to trying to destroy one another. There is benefit to trying to save the planet that we live on. And perhaps the people who oppose that are the ones who would be left out. Sorry, that's a very, very long-winded answer to your question. I hope I answered it. Please do write back, and I'll continue on and respond to any points that anyone wants to bring up. Let's carry on over here. Okay. What else did I want to? Okay, here we go. We mentioned the idea of like the ingathering of, at least from a Jewish perspective, ingathering of the exiles, the idea of resettlement of the land of Israel. And then you have people here in Israel who, again, there is a spectrum of particularly religious Zionist Jews who see the modern state of Israel as the first steps to the coming of the Messiah. So much so, the very first chief rabbi of Israel, Rav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, referred to Theodor Herzl, who was not a religious Jew whatsoever, as the Moshiach ben Yosef, Messiah, son of Joseph. There is a concept within Kabbalah. There are actually two messiahs. You have a Messiah who isn't necessarily religious, who maybe not even necessarily Jewish, who will allow or create an environment for the Messiah to come. That individual is referred to in Kabbalah as Moshiach ben Yosef, Messiah, son of Joseph, who the first chief rabbi of Israel in the late 1800s, early 1900s, referred to as Theodor Herzl, and religious Zionism bases their ideology on Rav Kook, and they see actions that take place today in the modern state of Israel is directly linked to the coming of the Messianic age. And there's a spectrum in there, and not everyone believes the same thing, but it's one of the reasons why you particularly see in the religious Zionist community, again, not the entire religious Zionist community, but in large portions of the religious Zionist community, an aversion to giving up land, parts of the land of Israel, as you saw in 2005, the disengagement of Gaza, particularly because they saw it as antithetical to the word of God and the concept that we are living in the Messianic age. Now that comes hand in hand, even though not all religious Zionists are Kabbalists, the vast majority of Kabbalists are religious Zionists. They see the modern state of Israel as the beginning of the Messianic age. And that's, again, depending on your own personal standpoint, can be seen as beautiful and wonderful, and how we can see the modern day within a theological, spiritual frame. And it could also perhaps be quite dangerous, right? That when you begin to equate the will of God and the acts of God with what's going on in the world today, and there are no prophets, there are no individuals who can speak to God, there is no one claims within Kabbalah or Judaism today who the Messiah is. So it becomes a dangerous game to play, particularly when you're speaking about, again, other people who live in this land, who want to have a home in this land, etc., etc. The idea of the resurrection of the dead, again, according to Maimonides, is part and parcel of this aspect, the coming of the Messiah. And there's a discussion as to what this looks like. Here are a bunch of different sources from Maimonides, from the book of Daniel, from the book of Isaiah, which are the sources for this very strange concept that at the end of days, every individual who has passed away, who will come back to life, will be resurrected, full stop, period. What that looks like is a matter of debate within different Kabbalistic works. So, for example, here I sent this piece of Armageddon that, and this also links into what Jacob was talking about before, that just like the human body in the resurrection, for the resurrection of the dead to take place, needs to be destroyed, according to the Arizal, famous Kabbalist, who said that the body is destroyed during resurrection of the dead, it comes back in its perfect form in the Messianic age. So too, says the Arizal, the world will also be in some way destroyed and reborn in a perfect state. Similar to the Christian concept of Armageddon, which is called Armageddon because according to the book of Revelations, again, this is the New Testament, I know this is a Jewish class, but whatever, sometimes it's fun to talk about other religions, I'm sorry. Armageddon is called Armageddon because the end of days will begin at Har Megiddo, which is in the north of Israel, Har Megiddo, which kind of then became, in the Greek translation, Har Megiddo Armageddon. Like the Hodor, hold the door type thing. Any Game of Thrones people out there. Anyway, continuing on. So there are other pieces here to take a look at. the idea also here, so there's the pieces in the Zohar, what does it look like when the resurrected come back to the dead? According to the Zohar, people who are unworthy, who weren't necessarily, didn't necessarily take advantage of their life when they were alive, will be like a withered tree, will be further away from the center of the Messianic saved world, and those who were good and who maximize their time in this world, who try to connect to the spiritual, will come back as good, strong individuals, like a tree that is brought back to life. Another aspect that comes from the Zohar of what it will look like, that the closer you are, or you're buried in Israel, particularly to the Temple Mount, the sooner your body will be resurrected, the better place it will have in the Messianic age. The source here from the Zohar is the reason for the tradition for individuals to want to be buried in the Mount of Olives. That's the source right over here. Mount of Olives overlooking the old city. It's a very prestigious place to be buried, particularly because of this notion of that when the Messiah comes, you'll be super duper close to the Har HaBayit, and you have a quick ticket, a short walk over the hill to get to the rebuilt temple. There are other aspects too that speak about you'll come back as yourself. The concentric circles piece I was talking about with reincarnation, that only the perfect reincarnated body, i.e. the individual who kind of completed the cycle that the soul required to go to Olam Haba, to come to the world to come, will be the one that's resurrected. Again, there's lots of pieces here of Ayin L'Ra'ata. It's an interesting like piece to look into in terms of what does it mean? Why is it such an important concept? Ultimately, it's interesting that Maimonides included also the resurrection of the dead as, again, in his top 13 principles of Jewish belief. He didn't include Shabbat, didn't include keeping kosher, he didn't include charity, he didn't include Tikkun Olam, he included belief in God, he believed that the Torah comes from God, he included the Messiah, he included resurrection of the dead. The reason why was because these are more difficult concepts to grasp, to get your head around. And if you're, according to Maimonides, if you're able to understand these, and everything else falls into place in terms of Judaism. And resurrection of the dead, the 13th, his final principle, is because it's the most difficult to understand. The idea being that each of us should see that we have a responsibility to bring about the best world that we want to live in. That we should ask ourselves every day, am I doing enough as an individual to bring about the world that I want to see, the world that I want to live in? Now that in itself is a question which is so pertinent to today in so many different ways. Whether we're talking about the age that we're living in terms of the coronavirus, that each and every single one of us has been confronted with, how is my behavior, just in regard to like going out the house and washing my hands and wearing a mask on my face, how is my behavior affecting the society that I live in, that if I don't necessarily practice these guidelines of social distancing, I personally could be responsible for the illness and death of another human being. On top of that, if we're looking also at the protests going on in the United States, but also around the world today, of the question of imploring and asking individuals just to take a look, to honestly ask themselves a question of, where am I in this debate? How have I either benefited from society, been dragged down from society? How much am I fighting to bring equality? Those questions have been presented and placed right in front of our eyes. And that essentially is the essence of the resurrection of the dead. I know I'm like running out of time, but I want to just, I'll come to a couple more questions if people have. That's the concept of resurrection of the dead. Of don't think that your task is finished. Don't think that just because you live on this earth for a limited period of time, that you don't have the ability to do something great, to change something, to bring about a utopian society, to bring about equality, to achieve tikkun olam. That's what resurrection of the dead is really about. That we might think, well, it doesn't really matter anymore. Let's talk about climate change. It doesn't matter. I'm living in a great world. Who cares what the world will be like in 100 or 200 years' time? Concept of the resurrection of the dead says, well, yes, it does matter. It matters in a very, very real way because you'll still be a part of this world. In a spiritual, mystical sense, literally. In a metaphorical sense, you will also still have a stake in this world. And finally, just to finish off, this is the ultimate question. This is the ultimate piece. We don't know ultimately what is beyond the veil of the physical world. It's a Kabbalist's dream. It's a Kabbalist's goal to see behind, to connect to the spiritual world. All we can do is prepare ourselves as best as we can. As I've just said, ask ourselves the question, am I doing, is everything that I'm doing today does it have the potential to bring about a better world? If everyone were to behave like I behaved, if everyone to seek out equality and justice and goodness and kindness like I did, would the world be a better place? Before I just give, if I know I'm sorry, I kind of went on a bit long there. I just wanted to finish off. I hope that you've gained something and learned something over the last 6 weeks. It's been a real pleasure and honor to sit with you and to learn with you all. Before I say goodbye for now, does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns as it relates to anything that we've discussed today or anything like that I could clarify for any of you? Okay, cool. If you do have any questions, you can always feel free to reach out to me. Thank you all so very, very much. I will miss seeing your faces, the square boxes in front of me once a week. I wish you all the best. And thank you. Take care, everyone. And I hope we get to see each other now again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.